scary stories.
I was out on a camping trip with my friends last summer. We'd gone to the mountains in West Virginia. It was something that you'd think was in some kind of coffee table picture book. There were large snow-covered trees that seemed to glisten in the sunlight, and there was not a single large building for miles. Only small log cabins that belonged to some of the locals. You could actually see every animal that crossed your path and not have to position yourself in some kind of weird way just to get a good look at them. We'd gone up there to do some hunting, fishing, and I wanted to try skiing for the first time. The other guy, Scott, that came with us, I didn't really like him. He was a loudmouth, pretentious, grouchy alcoholic. I did not really want to bring him with us, but he was David's friend, and I did not want to cause problems. Scott usually spent his time with a cooler full of his favorite beer beside him, complaining about every little thing that was going on in his life. Since meeting him, I never once heard him place the blame for things going wrong where it should have been. I had said before that I didn't really like Scott, and the way he was acting during this camping trip just gave me more of a reason to not like him at all. The entire time we were in the mountains, Scott was wasted and reeked of cheap beer. I don't understand how one person could ingest that much alcohol and not die from it. The way he looked at a case of beer was like how I looked at a brand new computer or food. I was honestly just waiting for this trip to end so that I could never have to see that moron ever again. We'd all gone to bed around midnight, and sometime around 2:30 in the morning, we were blinded by a giant bright light. We ran out of our car, and David desperately tried to get the engine to turn over, but it just would not turn over. Suddenly, these tall beings with large black eyes were standing outside of the car. We were panicking, and I literally pissed on myself. Scott pulls out his .22 250 hunting rifle and begins loading it. He points the gun at the window and blows out the back passenger window, killing one of the beings. The other 4 beings reach into the other side of the car and drag Scott out by his throat, slamming him on the ground. The other being goes back around the driver's side and smashes the driver's window and tries to grab David. David gets the car started and we drive off, leaving Scott behind. I look out the back window as we are driving off, and Scott is being lifted up by the light. 2 weeks later, Scott was found lying naked in a rural farm area. The police take him, and he's trying to explain to them what had happened that night. According to Scott, 2 guys in black suits came up to him and told him to keep his mouth shut or else he would regret it. Scott began using heavy drugs instead of drinking and now suffers from severe PTSD after the event. No one believes any of us when we tell the story. We know what we saw that night up there in the mountains. I have never been back to the mountains since then, nor have I been camping. I am just too afraid of what might be lurking up there for its next unsuspecting victim. I grew up in a town in a relatively rural area part of England. Once upon a time, the whole area had been ancient woodland, but by the time I grew up, their urban sprawl meant that only a few small pockets of woodland remained, entirely surrounded by housing estates. The quickest way to get anywhere from the street I grew up on was to take a footpath that ran from one end of the street around the back of the houses and then through maybe a quarter of a mile wide patch of woodland before you reached the heart of town. It only took a few minutes if you took the most direct path through, but my heart would be racing the whole time. I had to walk through there to get to school or to the shops when my mom sent me to go get groceries, and knowing that my older brothers would tell me that the woods were haunted by ghosts of people who had been hung at the gallows that once stood there. When I was a teenager, I became scared of the woods for a different reason. During the winter months, when it was already dark, when I walked home from school, other kids would sometimes lurk amongst the trees to scare the shit out of the smaller kids, demand what little money they had, or sometimes even their mobile phones. But I'm an adult now, so when I visited my mom in my hometown last winter, the woods no longer held any fear for me. It had snowed probably for the first time in a few years, and my mom, in typical mom fashion, immediately informed her elderly neighbor that her daughter was visiting and would happily take her dog for a walk so that she did not have to risk the icy pavements. The morning after I arrived back there, I found myself walking down the footpath in the woods with a fat, gray around the muzzle, old Labrador in tow. It doesn't often snow in the city I live in. Now I decided to take a recent purchase, a good DSLR camera, out with me to photograph the scenery, the fat old dog, and I wandered around the woods for 20 minutes or so, the dog hobbling a bit in the snow and occasionally making a half-hearted attempt to chase wood pigeons while I snapped photographs of snow-laden branches in the stark black and white landscape. It was quiet early on a Sunday morning, so nobody else was around, and there was very few other footprints in the snow. I was quite enjoying the walk, but I had started to get a bit cold and did not want to exhaust the neighbor's dog too much, so I was just about to head back when I heard something moving quickly through the woods towards us. Someone was heading rapidly down the main path. The dog and I were currently out of view of a path, but only for a few more seconds. I don't really know why it occurred to me to hide, but I did without really thinking about it. I hesitated for a moment, and then, mind full of memories of being accosted by hooded teenagers and robbed of my very first brick-like phone, I stepped off of the path and hid among the bushes and trees. The lens of my camera at the time was worth about the same as a month's rent, and I guess I was worried that some opportunistic robber would see it and decide that I was an easy target. The dog hesitated for a moment as I tugged at his lead, but followed into the bushes just in time. I crouched down with a hand on his head, willing him to be still and quiet. As a person came into view of the path just a few feet away, I didn't really get a good look at them, but I saw that it was a man, tall and wearing a dark jacket and red baseball cap, and moving in a hurry. Thankfully, the dog remained quiet, and then the man was gone. When the man was well out of sight, the dog and I stepped back onto the path and decided to take a few more pictures before we left. When we were finally heading home, the near silence of the woods was broken by the loud drone of a helicopter overhead. I could not see it clearly until we were on the footpath behind the houses and out from the trees, but once there I could see that it was a police helicopter and it was circling over the woods. I returned the fat old dog to my mom's neighbor without any incident and completely forgot about the helicopter until a little later when my mom switched the radio on in her kitchen so that we could listen to some music while we ate lunch. It was a local radio station, and their top news story was that they were hunting a man who had beaten someone nearly to death on a secluded footpath earlier that morning. The path they described linked the woods that I had been walking in to the center of town. The suspect was described as tall, wearing a dark jacket and a red hat. I saw him fleeing the scene of the crime, and it was only my paranoia about my new camera that prevented me from meeting him in the middle of the woods early in the morning with nobody else around. I don't know what would have happened if I would have stayed on the path, but I'm glad I never found out. His victim on the other footpath survived, but it was a close thing. This happened in 1971 or 1972 when my mother was about 14 or 15 years old. The incident occurred in a heavily wooded area near by Montevallo, Alabama, close to Birmingham. My mother is the oldest of 5 children. She has 3 sisters and a brother who is the baby of the family. One weekend in the cool months of the fall, my grandfather decided to take the whole family, my grandmother, my mother, and all of my aunts and uncles, so 7 people total, into the woods for target practice with a rifle. My mother grew up quite poor, and they didn't always live in the best neighborhoods, so my grandfather wanted to teach the kids how to defend themselves with a rifle if need be. Like I said, it was later in the fall, so the trees were bare and there were lots of leaves. on the ground. The wooded area was just off a dirt road, so there was a fairly rural area they were in. Since it was so far off the beaten path, my grandfather became startled when he heard the roar of a car engine so deep in the woods. My mom remembers the car as being a blue Ford Galaxy. Despite the fact that my grandfather had a gun, he totally freaked out and told my grandma and the kids to hide under a pile of leaves in the woods. The man in the driver's seat got out, dragged a woman's body out of the car, and just dumped her there in the woods and drove away. After my grandfather was sure that the man had gone, everyone came out of hiding, and the woman sat up and stared them straight in the face. My grandfather asked the woman if she needed help. She said no, she would be fine. She didn't seem to be injured and obviously didn't want help. She hadn't put up a fight with the man when he was dragging her out of the car. So my grandfather cut the shooting lesson short and decided to rush the kids home to safety. While on the trail back to the dirt road where my grandfather had parked their car, they passed the man in the blue Ford Galaxy driving out of the woods. My mom looked over and noticed that he had a huge machete laying across the front seats right beside him. My grandfather made sure that the man could see that he was carrying a rifle, but everyone was careful not to give away what they had just seen. The man struck up a small talk with my grandfather, asked him how he was doing and what they were doing out in the woods. My grandfather explained that he had just taken his family out for target practice with the rifle. The man told him to have a nice day and continued driving. The next day my grandfather went back out to the spot in the woods. There was not a body there. However, he did find the woman's wig, her purse, some Kleenex, and a pair of eyeglasses. He collected the items and took them home. According to my grandfather, the area of the woods was known for having shallow graves and being a dumping site for bodies. My mother became hysterical when he walked in the door carrying that stuff. She started screaming, "He killed that lady, he killed that lady." My grandfather ended up taking the items to the police station, but my mom doesn't think anything ever came of it. She never heard anything else about it after that. Well, she did hear one thing about it. I guess earlier the next morning my grandmother called my mom when she arrived at work. Just before the kids left for school, she told them not to take the bus that day, that she would come and pick them up and drive them to school. When my mom asked why, my grandmother said, "Because the car is waiting for you at the bus stop." If you are new, go ahead and hit the like button and subscribe to my channel, as it really helps me out. And if you are already subscribed, welcome back and thank you for subscribing.